There he is. Good morning.
Hey, Susan, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, and this is really good audio. Well, except that
Good.
I'm hearing my own voice. Do you hear it? Do I
Nope,
have an echo? Okay, then
nope,
that's
nope,
okay.
not on my end.
Wow, what a set of credentials. The page wasn't long enough.
Oh, yeah,
That's
I know.
impressive. So thanks
Because my
for,
mother,
yeah, go ahead.
I thought my mother once thought I just meant I couldn't keep a job. I was just hopping from place to place.
Oh, but what a perspective to have, especially the international one, which fascinates me because I've been doing a lot of stuff regarding China lately. So
Oh,
this is
yeah.
impressive. So let me tell you what you just got yourself into if you're game for this.
Okay.
So I've been doing a podcast series called Asia and the West, which is as part of a TED residency that I did last year. And I was asked if I would do an episode not related to China, but just in general around this whole issue of values and whether they matter, especially now. So, and I have a number of people in it who are kind of interesting. I included Chris Anderson, the guy who runs TED, because I thought what he's trying to do with TED is a very values-driven activity. The whole organization is run kind of on that fair, balanced, how do you serve all your constituency kind of approach. And a number of other people, some lawyers, people who are doing stuff in what they call impact investing, that kind of thing. And when I saw the New Yorker article, it really bounced off. It made some waves for me because it was underscoring something that people have not been talking about a lot, but I think is pretty impressive. I mean, I think there were probably 3 different people who mentioned Unilever in a positive way in the conversations that I've had on this issue. So when I saw,
Oh,
the New Yorker thing, I thought, okay, this is the other side of that. And Peter, may I call you Peter?
sure, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay, would really have a perspective. So my first question actually would be, and by the way this will work is I am in the process of creating a narrative around this, and then I will slot into that narrative the comments that have been made by a number of different people, which would be including you. So it won't be
Okay,
just this interview going out there. It will be you with a number of other people who kind of add richness
yeah,
to
okay,
whatever you have to say. So my first question would really be
sure.
is how do you define values, especially in connection with how companies function? What is a values-driven organization? What does that mean?
Well, can I just back you up a second? Just say
Yeah.
if you'd like me to say anything about China, happy to do that. We just published a book, came out about a month or so ago, based on interviews with the CEOs and founders of the biggest private companies in China. So, if you want me to do a contrast with that, I'm happy to do that as well.
Well, that would
Okay,
be
so back to
great. Yeah. Go ahead. So go ahead.
okay,
So,
back to the
yeah.
question.
The
Yeah, when someone says values-driven organization, what does that mean? I think, just to backtrack a little bit, a generation or so ago in business schools and most everywhere, when we talked about corporate governance, we talked about a stakeholder model. And the stakeholder model meant that the company had responsibilities to its stakeholders. One set were investors, but another set were customers. A third set was employees, and a fourth set was the community around them. That all gave way starting in the late 1980s to a very different kind of model, which was also driven by values, or you might say ideology. And this is sort of the rise of property rights and the view that there was really only one stakeholder, and that was the investors, and particularly the shareholders who owned the company, and that your responsibility was only to them. There was some case law that accentuated that gave shareholders the rights to sue their companies if the companies weren't doing enough to maximize shareholder value, if they were running poorly, that sort of stuff. But there was nothing that came down from the sky, as one of my colleagues said, that ever said that suddenly governance was supposed to be about this. But over time, that's the way things evolved. That's how we started rewarding executives. That's how we judged the success of companies. So I think now when you hear the phrase values-based companies, they are really just ones that are taking something like a different approach than the shareholder value approach. And it doesn't mean they've gone all the way back to the stakeholder model, but they've retreated a little bit from the model that says the only job a corporation has is to maximize shareholder value.
You know, I was going to ask you if was the pressure in the 80s somewhat a result of what they mentioned in the article? I think they referred to that the Harvard Business School professor who made a big deal about focusing on the investors. Did that give impetus to this, or was that not related in terms of timing?
Well, yeah, I think it was really an idea that drove all this. It wasn't big developments in practice. It was really ideological, and the idea was this idea that shareholders really own the firm and they should be in charge, and that was sort of the underlying assumption in economics all along, because it was a simple way to think about firms. In finance, the field of finance, where they think about shareholders, investors, and that sort of stuff, is their kind of focus. That was front and center. So what Mike Jensen was saying was really what finance researchers always thought, but he was just making the argument that everybody ought to think that way. And it was a kind of persuasive intellectual argument, even though I don't think in practical terms many people in the world of practice would liked it or necessarily agreed with it. So it was a kind of ideological takeover, you might say, of corporate governance, and it was led by academics, and it was pushed along by business schools. And because economics kind of controls public policy thinking, it got a big push in the public policy world as well. But yeah, it was an argument that came from academics.
That's so interesting. So then we get to the people who said, here's the pushback. As you said, there were some people who have said, no, actually, there is another way to look at this. And they may not refer to stakeholders, but they were certainly thinking about being of value on some level to the community, to employees, whatever. Could you talk about who was doing that? What are some examples of that? Is that where we get the Unilever picture?
Well, I think companies, if you were cynical, you might say they were always trying to have it both ways too. They were, one of the consequences of the shareholder value approach, if you really believe it, is that if all companies are required to do is maximize the gains to their shareholders, then somebody better rein them in to prevent them from really damaging the communities around them. And that was kind of the natural implication. So you might imagine the companies didn't want that. So they were always interested, even when shareholder value became a big deal, in their public image. But you could see they were kind of trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, when pushed to do something, they always had to justify it in terms of shareholder value. But in the arguments to the broader public, it was always that we were look, we're good citizens, we're doing things for the community, we have foundations, all that kind of stuff. So I don't think it's particularly new, but I think the pushback in the last 3, 4, 5 years, maybe the post-recession period, has been more organized, and again, kind of an intellectual argument about the possibilities that capitalism and small business in particular could actually benefit communities, sometimes by revitalizing them, sometimes by providing services better than the public sector might be able to do. So I think the social and corporate responsibility ideas got going relatively recently. In some ways, they are kind of a reaction to the shareholder value movement, but in some ways, they're also the companies trying to kind of have it both ways, right? Be seen as responsible to the communities, but then to the investors, being seen as completely focused on the investors.
So, Peter, what would you give as examples of the first part of that? The companies who, if you took this to an extreme, they would really be damaging their communities. So they sort of dance between the two. Can you give me an example of one of those?
Well, companies that close plants and move them overseas, and virtually all of the companies have been doing that. Anybody with manufacturing, right? Those are clearly not good things for the communities in which they operate. And virtually all these companies have foundations and things as well, and they sponsor local charities, and they get involved in, particularly these days, green initiatives, because they also save the companies money, So you can look at most of the fast food restaurants now, Walmart in particular, leading the way in green technology and trying to be ecological in their use of energy in particular. On the other hand, they're routinely bludgeoned for being bad employers and squeezing the employees in order to raise profits, right? So they're kind of doing both things at the same time.
So companies that's different. However, that sounds like an example. Those are examples of companies that have a way of operating, and then to counter that, or to counter the complaints about that, they have this other activity, whatever it is, regarding, could it be green, could be something else. So there is this idea, though, of having the values-driven piece of this be central, really in the DNA of the corporation, which is, as I understand it, the way Paul Pullman at Unilever has been proselytizing. And is that true? Do I have that right? That there are some companies that say it's one thing to sort of have this stuff on the side. It's another thing to figure out that really having the values be closely related, in fact, spring from the very products or services we're trying to sell. That's our goal.
Well, I don't know enough about Unilever and what they're doing to say, but clearly virtually every big company says they're values driven. They've all got these credos or statement of values, and they're almost all, nice things. They almost all say roughly the same stuff about, acting fairly and honestly and all that kind of stuff, and taking care of their communities. And they all say that. The question is, what do they do, right? So I don't think you should spend a lot of time thinking about what they actually say, because they almost all say that. And these, corporate value statements typically are sort of seen as meaningless. Until you start looking at what they actually do. So until we see action, I wouldn't pay much attention to them.
So is there anybody whose action is loud enough and visible enough that you could give it as an example of, okay, they've got it, they are doing it this way, and it seems to work for them?
When you get the list of companies that seem to do things like that, and I don't off the top of my head have exemplars, but they're usually private companies, and there's some reasons for that. They're not under the pressure from shareholders. The founder is often still around, So I think most of the sort of best places to work companies, the ones you hear that are really innovative, are ones that are privately held, and I'm afraid I just don't have off the top of my head a list of them right now.
Mm-hmm. But as far as publicly listed companies, nothing springs to mind.
No, nothing's springing to mind.
Has that changed any recently? Does this whole emphasis on values, is that being not even spoken about so much because it's not important anymore? It doesn't seem to be valued. You don't even have to fake it, sort of thing. Is there any indication of that things have shifted in the last several years that causes us to say this whole values idea is even less important?
Well, I think in the last 20 years, for sure, companies abandoned a lot of that rhetoric about being, concerned about the stakeholders in their communities. I think one of the things that started to happen is they got concerned about their reputations, particularly with consumers. And so you started to see them talk about issues that they think consumers care about, like the environment most conspicuously, right? The one that you almost never hear them talk about is jobs, right? So I can't think of an employer that brags about having good jobs for their employees and taking care of their employees. And part of the reason there is that labor is the biggest cost. And so that's a big undertaking. If you're really going to do great things for your employees, that's a big undertaking. So, they always say nice things to their own employees about how they manage their own employees. And they often say, that they're an employer of choice. But something that they try to build their brand around, I can't think of anybody who does that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is interesting how many companies talk about one of the reasons that they pay so much attention, assuming for the moment that they do more than just talk about it, is that millennials, people who want to come work for that company, are so vocal and interested in what it is, what kind of a place it is really to work for. Are they just doing charitable stuff on the side, or are they really good guys that make you feel great when you wake up in the morning and go there? And it sounds like what you're saying is, not so much.
Well, I think first, just to bust a bit of a myth here, if you look at the data on employees born in different time periods, the baby boomers, at least when they were entering the labor force, actually expressed more concern about these social issues than anybody born recently does. There's a sharp decline after the baby boomers, and there's actually not any compelling evidence that the kids today are more concerned about this than the kids a while ago. I think what does get the employer's attention is when the labor market tightens. In the Great Recession, you could be an awful employer, and it didn't matter very much because there were so few jobs around. But, where jobs outnumber available workers, like you look in the tech world in Silicon Valley, right? That is one place where they are talking about how wonderful they are to their employees, particularly Google, right? So that's an exception there. But the reason for that is they always struggle because they're trying to find the very best of a very small pool of people with extremely unique skills. So they are playing to the employees there. But I think in general, when the labor market tightens, companies will start worrying more about how they're perceived by employees. They've already started worrying about how they're perceived by customers. And, I think that concern is probably going to continue. But how much of that really changes the way they operate, that's not so clear.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that there's a contrast, an interesting way to at least compare what's happening in Asia, specifically China and the West, about this. Do you want to tell me something about that?
Well, maybe first start with India, where we wrote a book about this. It parallels the China book. We did the India book first, where we interviewed the CEOs of the biggest companies in India, and they really are exemplars in this regard. That is, they are deeply concerned about the social purpose for their businesses. They spend a lot of time and a lot of money on that social purpose. They don't rate shareholder concerns as being very important to them. I think they rate them fourth on their priority list. And above that, above shareholder value, is being a personal role model for their employees. So they actually worry about how they sort of comport themselves as a way of creating models of how the employees should behave. So I think they get all the benefits of that. It's easier to recruit people if you've got a social purpose. It's easier to motivate people if you are managing an organization to do social good. In the U.S., trying to motivate people around the goal of making shareholders rich is a really, really hard thing to do. Why should I care if we make more money and the shareholders get wealthy, maybe my pay goes up a little bit, but if I'm an employee, I don't have stock options. That isn't even true, right? So the Indian companies are exemplars on this. I think the Chinese companies, the shareholders there don't have nearly the influence that they have in the U.S. It's about like India. In China, the founders of the private companies tend to still be around, and they're billionaires several times over. And at least for the most part, they're not so concerned about squeezing the last dollar out of their company operations. They are worried, though, about growth. And I think this is, to the extent to which they have a social purpose, it very much is about creating jobs for the country. And I think the government wants them to do that, and they're kind of pushed to do that. As you might imagine, one thing that's pretty different in China, where you have a communist government, is the idea that the private sector ought to be taking on social responsibilities is not exactly in vogue, right? So the idea that companies ought to be involved in the local level, even on charities and things like that, doesn't happen all that much. But it is starting to happen in some places in China, and it's going to be very interesting to see, because it's quite a contrast between the idea of a central government that's supposed to be responsible for everything, and you got these private independent companies that are, some of them quite rich and possibly powerful. Does the government want them involved in local schools, involved in, improving social welfare in the communities where they operate? It's not so clear yet.
Would you have examples of that? I mean, does Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, do any of those companies fit in what you just talked about?
Yeah, I think they all do. I mean, I'm trying to think of any company that really plays a big role in their communities, and I can't think of any actually. They're not big on charity, at least yet. The corporate leaders and owners. And their companies, more or less, compared to companies in the West, stick to their business and are not so engaged with the communities.
But job creation is a big deal.
Job creation is a big deal. Now, India, India, very different. The companies in India very involved in charities, very involved in social work in their communities.
What about the SOEs in China, the state-operated companies? Are they different in this, that they're not so involved in, what's their position vis-a-vis the privately held companies?
Well, they're asked to serve more social purposes than the private companies are, and a lot of that has to do with jobs. And they're under more pressure not to lay people off, for example, if business goes down. And they're asked to develop in places where they might not necessarily want to do so themselves, the leaders. The leaders of these state-owned enterprises are all political appointees. So they're kind of arms of the government more. But even there, they're not so involved or directly involved in independent activities in their communities. They're not, you wouldn't see them doing what U.S. companies do and sponsor local sports teams and, try to do fundraising for local charities and try to help the schools or something. You don't see very much of that, even in the state-owned enterprises.
Peter, you said you just did this China study. That book is not yet out, or is it out?
It just came out. It's called Fortune Makers. I've got three co-authors, Mike Yusim, Harbir Singh, and Neng Lang, who is at the Chinese European International Business School. The rest of my colleagues are at Wharton.
Super. I'm going to look for that. Now, the Indian one, when did you do that?
We did that about 2-3 years ago, and that's called The India Way. Most of the same authors there.
Mm-hmm. And so those are all pretty current. So comparing the U.S. to that, then, it sounds like we've got all this activity around outside charities, a lot of philanthropy. But the stuff about being truly values-driven, it sounds like, is either window dressing or it's not being taken terribly seriously, and in fact, there's pushback against it by shareholders when they're active. And is that too much a shorthand of?
No, I think that's about right. There's big pushback on anything that doesn't maximize shareholder value by most of the investors, and the CEOs have to make a case for pretty much anything they're doing that it advantages shareholders, or they just don't try to do it. The values approach, I'd say for the most part, is instrumental in the sense that it's designed to attract consumers or placate consumers. For the most part, it's just consumers. They're involved in charity through foundations and things like that, but compared to the scale you would see in most other countries rather, it's pretty tiny.
So this whole idea of impact investing, the groups that are putting together investments in which people are measuring, does this do good for the community and still give me some kind of return? How does that fit into this picture?
It's been around for a long time. I mean, I can remember it at least back a generation ago. We had the same kind of arguments and the same kind of small investment operations trying to do that. So I don't think it's anything new. I think the problem for impact investors is that virtually all the owners with big influence are institutional investors now, pension funds and mutual funds in particular, and they tend not to be active investors. Well, I shouldn't say that. They tend not to be socially active investors. That is, they are much more inclined than in the past to complain if companies are not managed well. CalPERS, the biggest pension fund in the world, I think it's still the biggest private investor. CalPERS was famous for publishing a list of companies that it thought was underperforming. So if you want to start a fund to be an active investor and invest only in those companies that are doing good, good luck. The problem is that the market is completely done by investors that aren't paying attention to that. So,
Peter,
it's hard for
Peter, there was a part of that sentence, and I think it was a really important part that just got cut off. You said, so if you want to start a fund, good luck, and then the rest of it was cut off.
Okay. So if you want to start an impact investing fund with the goal of trying to influence these corporations, good luck, because you're going to be so tiny compared to the other investors who don't have that orientation that they're more or less going to ignore you. Now, the one place where that isn't true is that on some aspects of governance now, boards of directors in public companies are quite concerned about corporate governance, but it is mainly around, again, shareholder values. It is mainly about things like how we pay the executives. And there, the outside community has had a fair amount of influence in shaping how companies run. But I think the reason for that is that they have some big chunk of the investment community behind them. They don't want executives paid too much for doing nothing. They want to make sure that CEOs who are performing poorly can be pushed out. And, those people in the investment world who pushed for that have gotten pretty far.
It's interesting you're saying all this because just recently when I read the article about Melissa Meyer and her compensation from Yahoo, and people were saying, wait a minute, why was she paid $900,000 a week when she, didn't perform? And they're saying, well, the shareholders are happy, and that was the measure. So that fits exactly with what you've been saying here.
There, I think that, with that one, I think that's where the activist investors, the corporate governance folks, would be yelling, though, because the shares did well at Yahoo because of their earlier investments in Alibaba. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that Yahoo performed well. It was that what Yahoo owned.
And that was Jerry Yang. That didn't even have much to do with her. Yeah, pretty interesting. Right. Well, This is absolutely fascinating. I am so delighted with your your coverage of all this stuff. If I think of anything else, I'll give you a holler. But
okay,
just because I'm fascinated personally. Has this been underscored at all by the election of our current administration? Is the attitude about who should be valued and who should get the rewards of any activity, has that been exacerbated by a Trump administration, or am I?
Well, I don't think we know yet. I mean, the one thing we hang on.
Oh wow, there's a dog.
Yeah, there's a dog. Yeah. So back up. I don't think we know yet what the effects of the administration will be on these actions and these beliefs. What we do know is that they don't seem to care very much about workers. So the actions they've taken so far pull back restraints on the ability of companies to manage employees. So safety rules are being pulled back, and regulations that you might, if you on the worker side, would see as protecting workers, those are being pulled back. So that's all we can probably put our finger on right now. But it'll be really interesting to watch and see how the administration might change corporate values. I mean, at the moment, the administration seems to be, frankly, to the right of the corporate world, at least the big companies. And I think part of that is because the big companies are sensitive to their consumers and their public appearances. But maybe public opinion will change on that.
Well,
Sorry.
that note is the perfect one. He sounds like he's cheering, and thank you, thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
This was great, and
Sure,
I'll
my
let you know
pleasure.
when we get around to publishing this. Thanks
Yeah,
so much.
good luck. Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.